Hi y'all, it's Swank Ivy with another Letters to an Asexual, and this is number 133. Today I'm going to talk about curiosity and the kinds of questions that people feel entitled or compelled to ask us and our responsibility in answering those. The person that I'd like to feature is somebody that sent me a message through YouTube regarding my participation in a documentary called Asexual, which was on Netflix and some other platforms back in the day. And I don't feature this person specifically as a particularly terrible example of this attitude, but it did allow me to elaborate on my thoughts on people who feel like I'm just a curious person. I'm a very naturally curious person, so I'm going to ask you these deeply personal questions. Happens to asexual people and other people who live with marginalized identities. So, first, I'm going to read you this person's initial query, and the subject line was Simple Curiosity. Hello, Miss Ivy. I just saw the documentary you were part of on Netflix, and I had a particular question and thought you might be one of the best people to answer it. From your videos, I have seen that most seem to ask you offensive questions, or at least those are the ones you answer. The question I have, I do hope is not offensive. It is simple curiosity, which I hope I am presenting in the right way. It may be a bit tough to word this question to get the answer I'm looking for, so if I ramble on, please forgive me. I would like to know if it is lonely being asexual. I can grasp somewhat the idea of loneliness of people not understanding a part of you, and perhaps feeling alienated from society for something you can't control. I myself have characteristics that others view as problems, which I cannot change nor control to a great degree. I suppose what I mean by lonely is relationship-wise. Society tends to say sex is not everything in a relationship. And I suppose the best way to know if that is true is to ask someone with no sexual desire. Is it lonely not having a partner, a significant other, even without sexual desire? Do you still feel the desire to be close to someone, physically in a sense, feeling their warmth? If your partner wrapped their arms around you, would you still feel safe and secure? Or are those experiences absent? I apologize if these questions are offensive. I have a strong desire for knowledge and understanding. I am not asexual, so the only way to answer these questions are by asking someone. I suppose I'm curious as to where emotions and sexual desire separate. However, if I have not offended you, I would deeply like a reply and would hope for further discussion. If you don't want to message me back on here, here's my email. I hope to hear from you soon. My reply. The answer to your question is different for everyone, since asexual people don't all feel the same about relationships or the intimacy they want in them. Some asexual people are the people person type, or may like cuddling and/or want romantic relationships or other close relationships, but others completely don't. And they have the same variability of interest in physical closeness that any other group of people has. Physical intimacy is not always sexual. And it seems from your question you already know that. So it's probably not surprising to you that some asexual people still like physical closeness and intimacy. However, as for me personally, I'm not romantic. Don't have any desire whatsoever to have any kind of partner, regardless of whether they wanted to touch, and don't personally like cuddling or prolonged contact, and being without it does not make me feel lonely at all. There's no void where that aspect of human interaction should be, because I'm formed as a whole person without it. So I hope you don't process it as a deficit or an incomplete person. I just don't really enjoy being close to other people for anything more than a hug, or on occasion I might share a blanket with someone if I'm cold, not while sleeping though. And I think massage is okay, if the person is good at it and doesn't try to creep on me. As for where do emotions and sexual desire separate, I don't think that's a question you can get answered explicitly, because the answer is literally different for different people. Some non-asexual people do feel that their romantic and sexual attraction are inextricably linked, for instance, and that one would fade if the other did. or would never develop if the other wasn't there too. But yet, other non-asexual people have been romantically attracted to someone they don't find sexually appealing, or the opposite. They find someone sexually appealing, but not romantically so. I don't think you could just find one non-asexual person and pose the question, so, where exactly is the line between sexual and romantic attraction? It would not only be different for different people, but sometimes it would even be different for the same person when applied to different partners. That's why I, as an aromantic asexual person, can only answer what I personally feel. And I believe I did that. But please do not generalize my answer as a solution to where the line is between emotions and sexual desire, on behalf of asexual people specifically, or people in general. Hope that makes sense. This person replied again and said, "Hello, Ivy. I found your answer did make a great deal of sense, but still provokes my curiosity. I agree with your point of view that there is never one answer any group of people can fit in. Allow me to tell you a bit about myself, so you may get a better understanding before I ask more questions. I have been pushed around in the mental health system for a few years now. I have fallen under a variety of labels, the current of which are bipolar, depression, and anxiety disorder. However, I have had a therapist label me a term not widely used called a semi-sociopath, the having psychosis, and so on. Because of this treatment, I found myself having a fascination with the brain on a psychological, sociological, and physiological level. I am a naturally curious person who likes to understand things, especially those which seem strange, rare, or simply misunderstood. While I am a strong believer that there is no simple fix-all pill or one true answer to any question, I still believe in the pursuit of answers. I'm not sure how much you know about mental disorders, Miss Ivy, but it is not a pretty nor accurate process. Compared to the rest of the medical system, it is rather archaic. Simply, all you can do is sit in front of a psychologist, talk to them, go see a doctor, and they throw pills at you, hoping to balance out brain chemistry. They are unable to measure the chemicals in the brain or figure out the receptors in the brain which accept these chemicals to treat these inflictions properly, making it very easy for one disorder to be mistreated for another. My curiosity for asexuality lies in the similarity of the stigmas. I noticed in the documentary how some saw being asexual as a choice, just as some of my friends have told me they don't believe I have depression, I'm just lazy. I even had one girl tell me that there are no such things as mental disorders. I do not believe asexuality is a mental disorder. However, with its rarity and lack of understanding others, treat it that way. Similarly to how homosexuality was treated. While it may be difficult, I believe it is possible to map out an understanding of the human brain. While there may not be one answer for everyone, the opposite is true. There cannot be truly an infinite number of answers. A key question a lot of people ask themselves when faced with being labeled different is they want to know why they are different. Even an answer of knowing a certain part of your brain produces chemical A, which causes your brain to operate in this way, could make a world of difference for a single individual. That is my purpose for trying to know where sexual attraction ends and emotional attraction begins. I will admit, though, when I first saw the documentary and even wrote my first letter, I was greatly confused by the idea of asexuality. While I did not believe it was impossible, it was just an unfamiliar concept. However, I tend to find unfamiliar concepts exciting. However, after I read your response, I realized that after thinking of the idea of asexuality, I found it very comforting, which may sound strange. It seems in knowing an asexual person would be, in a way, freeing, at least in our culture, which is overly stimulated with the idea of sex. Sorry if I tend to ramble on a bit. I have a bad habit of doing that, especially with people I find fascinating. Let me then direct my question towards your type of asexuality. I believe you used the term aromantic. I find that form particularly fascinating, as it hinges on another psychological border I am interested in. Also, sorry if I make you feel like a lab rat or an experiment. Sometimes in my pursuit for knowledge, I have a bad tendency to seem a little too overzealous and make people feel as if I am too impersonal. If any question I ask is too personal, simply tell me, and I will back off the subject. I simply like trying to understand people, and the best way to do that is to talk to them. Do you, yourself, feel love or compassion for anything non-human? I do not mean sexually. I mean, have you ever felt a bond with an animal like a dog, lizard, etc.? Or perhaps an animated or fictional person? Or perhaps an object that you considered special and liked to have around you at all times? I replied in quote style, so quoting this person, I am a naturally curious person who likes to understand things, especially those which seem strange, rare, and simply misunderstood. I replied, yes, actually, you might be surprised by how many people who write me letters say almost the same exact thing word for word, mentioning their natural curiosity and desire to fully understand the unusual. I get this a lot as a preamble to very in-depth personal questions. At least for the most part, people are understanding if I don't want to discuss the answers. Quote, while I am a strong believer that there is no simple fix-all pill or one true answer to any question, I still believe in the pursuit of answers. My reply, hopefully you are not saying that because you believe my answer of there are different answers for different people is not actually an answer. I want to be sure you don't generalize my answers to apply to lines of intimacy, lines between physicality and emotion, or all asexual people's experience. I can only speak for myself, and am speaking to you now in that context. Quote, I'm not sure how much you know about mental disorders, Miss Ivy, but it is not a pretty nor an accurate process. My reply, I'm minored in psychology and have mentally ill family and friends. I'm fairly well informed in the general sense. Quote, compared to the rest of the medical system, it is rather archaic. Simply all you can do is sit in front of a psychologist, talk to them, go see a doctor, and they throw pills at you, hoping to balance out brain chemistry. My reply, yep, that reflects the experience of just about everyone I know. It's trial and error at its heart. And people outside the system often still insist its methods are reliable and trustworthy. Quote, my curiosity for asexuality lies in the similarity of the stigmas. My reply, you don't have to have a reason to be curious about something. But yes, the desperation of everyone else to cure people who are not like them and push them into the appearance of normalcy is very similar between asexual people and people with mental illnesses. Quote, while it may be difficult, I believe it is possible to map out an understanding of the human brain. Even an answer of knowing a certain part of your brain produces chemical A, which causes your brain to operate in this way, could make a world of difference for a single individual. My reply, yes. The questions being asked and the investigations being done are not a problem. The way they tend to be used, however, is often problematic. For example, if a gay gene was isolated, that could boil down to gay being a heritable condition and understood as exclusively a physical condition, and not only would it be invalidating those who did not have the gene, who still experience themselves as gay, it would also become vulnerable to people trying to cure it, even though it is not a disease. Same goes for trans people. In an attempt to investigate, some have looked for differences between male and female brains, and found that sometimes trans women, assigned male at birth, have certain physical brain aspects more commonly associated with cis women. Some might say this legitimizes their trans experience, but A, why should science be handed the keys to deciding whether someone really experiences themselves as trans? And B, what if you failed to test as trans, and then you couldn't qualify for surgeries or therapies you wanted? If we insist on a measurable/physical explanation for subjective experiences, we will necessarily alienate and erase some of the people we hope to better understand. These investigations are not carried out in a vacuum, with information gathered just so curious people can say, how about that? And then do nothing with the findings. And they certainly aren't guaranteed to be funded by people who have no agenda. I know that people might misuse this knowledge is no reason to avoid acquiring said knowledge, but I am very wary of certain attitudes behind requests to isolate the reason behind asexuality. If I may quote my friend M, I think a search for a cause for one's asexuality can too often go down a road of biological determinism, which leads to questions of hormone levels or an asexuality gene. It devalues the role of the myriad other aspects of one's life in molding who one is as a person. They also said this, I hate this question because it falls into a tendency to search for causation that belies a need to pathologize. No one ever asks heterosexual individuals what caused their sexual orientation. When we ask individuals what causes some part of them, we are saying, do you know why this thing is wrong with you? We are also saying, if you do know, do you think we could change it so this doesn't happen to anyone else? I will reiterate that I don't assume any and all questions about how asexuality forms as an identity must be about pathologizing asexuality or snuffing it out. And that is not how I'm interpreting your comment. But I agree with M in that some people interrogate and research and dig and experiment with situations like asexuality, partly because they do not think asexual individuals come to their identity organically, the same way heterosexual people do. The real answer, as far as I know, is that some asexual people are asexual because their hormones or biological structures push them that way. Some are asexual because they are influenced to think that way because of experiences in their lives or other factors. Some are asexual because of psychological predisposition to view other people a certain way. Some are asexual because of a mix of those and other factors, etc. People who are just curious never seem to be curious about why people are heterosexual to the extent that they want to map out all the ways people can arrive at a heterosexual identity. If the lack of interest in investigating heterosexuality is based on the perception that it's boring, standard, default, ordinary, then that makes sense, sure. It just becomes uncomfortable for us when so much of the curiosity-inspired scrutiny we encounter contains an aftertaste of skepticism about whether our experience of ourselves is authentic. Especially certain markers would lead to flippant invalidation. For example, even though some of heterosexual people's sexual drive is known to be connected to hormones, people generally don't say, you only think you want sex because your hormones are telling you you do. It's oversimplified, it's misleading, and it's ultimately not useful in their lives. This is why interest in something like asexuality, however driven it is by pure curiosity, needs to be pursued delicately and with openness to multiple possibilities and individual variation. Quote, "It seems in knowing an asexual person would be in a way freeing, at least in our culture which is overly stimulated with the idea of sex." My reply, for the most part, an asexual person not having one set of problems leads directly to having a different set of problems. If you're interested, I recently wrote an essay about positive misconceptions about asexuality, and I linked the person to it. This is a list of some thoughts on why statements about our perceived freedom, innocence, simplicity, superiority, or purity are based on incomplete understanding or misunderstanding. Quote, "Let me then direct my question towards your type of asexuality. I believe you used the term aromantic." My reply, asexual is my sexual orientation. Aromantic is my romantic orientation. Aromanticism is not a type of asexuality, but people do tend to have a sexual orientation and a romantic orientation, which often go together to describe what partners they're attracted to. Many people don't need to separate them. In the asexual community, we generally do, but I experience neither sexual nor romantic attraction. Quote, "Do you yourself feel love or compassion for anything non-human? I do not mean sexually, I mean, have you ever felt a bond with an animal like a dog, lizard, etc., or perhaps an animated or fictional person, or perhaps an object that you considered special and liked to have around you at all times?" My reply, I'm not really interested in animals. Other than that, I have the usual appreciation for fictional characters I might particularly like, objects that I might like collecting or aesthetically appreciate, etc. I feel love and compassion for humans too. I just wouldn't call it being in love with them in a romantic sense. Neither would I call my appreciation of anything fictional or sentimental to be anything out of the ordinary or taking place of the passion a significant other would absorb in a partnered relationship. I have made jokes about wanting to date cartoon characters, wanting to have a favorite author's children, etc., but those are not expressions of romantic interest or lust. They're humor. I don't know why you asked the question you did, but if you were wondering whether I have romantic or otherwise passionate feelings for people or things that cannot reciprocate, or if you were asking this in the sense of framing my hypothetical interest in an inanimate or non-human thing as a stand-in or replacement for the kind of feelings non-aromantic people have for partners, the answer decidedly is no. Hope this answers your questions. And the person did not reply. That was a relatively respectful way to say I'm asking all of this because I'm a curious person, especially the part where they said I don't want to make you feel like a lab rat. I'll stop if you don't want to talk about this kind of thing. But if you have done any kind of activism about a marginalized identity you may have, including asexuality or aromanticism, you have probably encountered people who are way more determined to get answers out of you. And if you ever say, well, that's personal, or you answer a question that was meant to be personal with a general answer, they will sometimes go on the offensive and say, look, I'm just curious. I'm just a really curious person. I have a scientific mind. I wonder about things. I think deeply, blah, 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 sort of defending their pursuit of information at the expense of your comfort. And sometimes they will be frustrated or offended by your refusal to engage with that, or even your suggestion that you don't consider that to be an appropriate question. Obviously, if let's try it from the perspective of a person who might be, somebody who would be facing me with this question, and try to slide into that perspective first. I would like to tell a person like that we're not necessarily like attacking you by saying, we don't want to be asked that question, or I don't want to be asked that question. I don't feel comfortable in this situation talking to you about this. First of all, that's where you stop. And you can apologize if you want to. You don't have to, but definitely stop if someone says, I'm uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that they're shaming you. It doesn't mean that they're saying, I hate curiosity. But what it does mean is this isn't the person that you should be going to get that curiosity satisfied. No one is trying to tell you that you're wrong to wonder certain things. And I've seen this a lot, if I may make a digression. I've seen this a lot with questions people have about trans people, often very personal questions about their genitals or what happens during or after gender-affirming surgeries, etc. They want to ask very specific, personal, private questions, and the majority of people, even those that speak out on the topic and are accessible to the general public, often don't want to talk about those things with their own experiences in mind. And then you just almost always see people replying and saying, how are we ever going to understand if you won't engage with us? If you don't want to talk about this, maybe you shouldn't be an activist. You need to be completely open and willing to expose every aspect of your personal life if you feel like anybody should ever be listening to you in an activist capacity. And none of that is true. I feel like anybody who wants to make materials, they get to decide how much they want to reveal about their own personal life. And sometimes they might be sensitive people. Sometimes they might be relatively private people who want to speak in the general. And none of that means that you're wrong to have those questions. What it does mean is you're going to have to go about pursuing the answers in a different way. You can find willing partners to those conversations. You can provide preambles and say, hey, I have some really specific and maybe private questions about your anatomy or your history sexually, or the nature of the question that you want to ask, and say, would you be willing to talk about that with me? And you don't have to justify it or anything. You can ask the question. There are people who are willing to talk about that sort of thing. Some of them may have already made materials that you can search for. And an offshoot of this type of person who tends to defend their curiosity and tends to defend asking uncomfortable questions and kind of being smacked down is the kind of person who says, I should be allowed to engage with you on this under my own preferences. I learn by interacting. I don't want to Google it. I want your perspective. I have to learn in this specific interactive way, and I'm never going to learn if you won't engage with me, kind of, defensive posture in these arguments. I've definitely encountered that many times from people who want to be personally educated by people who are saying, I don't want to, I don't feel comfortable doing that. Sometimes that's because they don't like something about your attitude. Sometimes it's just their own preference to not disclose that stuff publicly. And sometimes it's because they don't have a relationship with you. So you have to respect that. That's where they're coming from. And you're certainly not going to be able to get satisfactory answers by pressuring them into a corner and being like, this is your responsibility to answer my questions. It has to be on my terms. It has to be according to the line of questioning that I prefer, or how am I supposed to learn? And none of that happened in the example conversation that I showed you. But I did kind of detect this, like, hey, I'm a curious person. I'm only asking these questions because, I am by nature a very inquisitive and scientifically minded person. And, that was kind of the most polite example that I could find that wasn't also, argumentative. But most of you who have had these conversations have probably encountered the more argumentative type of people. I used to have a friend who would frequently defend his intense curiosity, and he would say things like what I just described. He would say, I can't be expected to learn if people won't answer my questions. How am I supposed to find this information? But he would also act like his curiosity was a need. He would say, these things that I'm wondering are, it's like I'm in pain. It's like I have an itch, and now I'm angry at you because you won't scratch my itch. You won't medicate my pain. He would set it up like that. And this is not a person that I talk to anymore, partly because of stuff like that. He felt that because we had a relationship, he was allowed to say whatever the hell he wanted to. And when I said, okay, I don't want to talk about this subject makes me uncomfortable, it would immediately be like, I wish you were a curious person so that you would understand my compulsion for curiosity. We had this really weird interaction once where I had just met a new friend at a party. He had not been at the party, but I met a new friend at the party, and she asked me not to tag her in photos if I put up photos on Facebook or social media. She said, yeah, don't tag me because I have a stalker. So I was like, yeah, sure, fine. And when my friend that I'm talking about later viewed the pictures and he wanted to know how come there's one person who isn't tagged in the photos, I said, oh, well, she asked me not to tag her because she has a stalker. And he's like, well, what's happening? Who's stalking her? Why are they stalking her? I was like, I don't know. I didn't ask her. And he goes, you didn't ask her? I'm like, no. If you think about it, somebody who says they have a stalker and they're kind of hiding from the stalker, they're taking specific measures to avoid being identified in case the stalker uses that to find them. That sounds like a pretty traumatic situation that I don't really have the right to that information when I've just met a person, right? I don't really feel comfortable even saying, oh, tell me your whole story of trauma, right? From someone that I just met at a party. And my friend got furious at me, and he said, well, now I'm never gonna know. I'm curious about this, and because you didn't ask this reasonable question, I'm never gonna know, and that's gonna eat me alive, and it's your fault that you didn't ask the question, and now I'm never going to get the story, and I'm going to remember this, and I am going to wonder about it for the rest of my life, and that's your fault. You made me suffer. It was a ridiculous tirade that he went on, telling me that I was responsible for this curiosity that he could now never have sated because he had no contact with this person or no way to get a hold of her to find out her traumatic stalker story that he just needed to know. And I had had other interactions with him that were similar, where, he would not take no for an answer when I would say, yeah, I don't want to talk about that. I don't feel comfortable disclosing the details about that. And first he would try to ask the question different ways as if I was a keyword operated Google machine, and if he could just find the right phrase to spit at me, I would eventually tell him what I wanted. And I would end the conversation. Sometimes I would have to hang up the phone and be like, you won't listen to me, you won't stop pressuring me to talk about something that I was very clear that I don't want to talk about this. And he would frequently act like I was hurting him by not talking about these things. And even though in this case I definitely feel like there was some mental illness going on with him, he did have some issues that, he was not specifically diagnosed with anything like obsessive compulsive disorder or anything, but sometimes I saw like tendencies that it seemed like he would get a one-track mind about things, and he would act like that. He would become furious that he couldn't have something that he was thinking about. If he couldn't think of a specific song that he wanted and it was bothering him, he would listen to the radio for days hoping the song would just randomly come on and remind him, stuff like that. And he would tell me like, well, I mean, what else am I supposed to do? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, it sounds awful, right? Like, it sounds awful to be plagued by that. But I guess the point is that regardless of the intensity of somebody's curiosity and how much they want to know a piece of information that might be personal about someone else, they don't actually have the right to put that on someone who's not willing to disclose. And it is not appropriate to keep pushing in those situations. But I do think that it is fine to have curiosity about unusual lifestyles and whatnot. It's certainly not wrong to ask questions. And I think that the person that I talked to was barking up the right tree in contacting someone who had made it clear they were an activist, considering I appeared in a documentary and talked about my experience. So that's a good place to start. But in situations like that, you also have to know the right place to stop. So that's my perspective on that, and I will end this one here. Happy New Year! Thanks for watching.